The Reverend Samuel Cooper, he dunned as he was shaking hands with his parishioners at the end of the service. He nodded as Johnny told him that 8 shillings were due on the paper, but a fashionable woman standing by said it was a fair scandal for boys to be intruding into God's house and dunning a clergyman, and if collecting bills wasn't work, what was? She could call a constable and have the impertinent imp whipped for Sabbath breaking. Mr. Cooper had to cough so he could pretend not to be laughing, and he winked at Johnny in spite of the dignity of his black clericals, white bands, and great woolly wig. "Outsell my brother William too, eh?" he offered. "Brother William and I will both pay you tonight." Johnny found 4 more of the members also at this meeting, and then headed for Beacon Hill. At all the great mansions he commonly went to the back door, either to leave newspapers or to collect bills. A skinny, slippering-looking old black slave in the kitchen told him Mr. Hancock was in bed with a headache. No, she would not permit Johnny to go to his bedchamber. So the boy went to the front door, rang the bell, hoping some other less obdurate servant might let him in. Maybe little Jehu. The old slave guessed what he was up to and got there first. Might he not send a note up to Mr. Hancock? They wrangled a little, and at last she said yes, he might. She was preparing a catnip tea to send to the master. He could write a note and put it on the tray. In the kitchen, he wrote his note. Mr. Hancock owes the Boston Observer 8 shillings. Folded it, and on the outside wrote, John Hancock, Esquire. Was it only 2 months before he had tried to write those very words and failed so miserably? The cook was squatting at the hearth, toasting thin toast. Johnny lifted the teapot to set his note under it. That teapot! Its handle was the shape of a winged woman. Beside it was the creamer that he had loved so much. Even now he could shut his eyes and feel it in his hands. Ah, a sugar basin to match. Mr. Hancock had indeed found a smith to make it after Mr. Lapham failed so lamentably. Behind the cook's back, Johnny lifted it in trembling hands. The handles were wrong, done exactly as Johnny had started to do them before he talked with Mr. Revere. He thought with longing, but contentment, of that other basin, the one that had been exactly right and never completed. This one he held in his hands was nothing, trash. But how beautiful, how perfect had been the other one. If I had to hurt my hand, I'm glad it was while doing something worthwhile, not merely mending an old spoon. The cook's wiry black fingers were in his hair. You no account! Don't you never think to go stealing sugar in this house? Mr. Hancock is that generous. I'd have given you a piece if you had asked politely. Next to the Hancock house was the Lights. Mr. Light, in his effort to play both ends against the middle, did take the Observer, and every Thursday Johnny habitually crossed from one stable yard to the other. There was no reason he should do so today. But it was as he told Scylla. He just about couldn't help watching the Lights. What did they do on Sundays? Would the merchant be home today? He might have asked Captain Bull to dine with him. Would he see Miss Lavinia? Or only the fat cook, the scullery maids, Aunt Best, or the stablemen? The cobbled stable yard was deserted. He did not hear the usual chatter from the kitchen. He glanced at the dining room window, the one Mr. Light thought he broke the night the cup was stolen. Doubtless now that cup Mr. Light had actually stolen from him stood with the other 3 on the sideboard. His jaw clenched. Sometime, some day, he would get it back, and not by snitching it either. A horse came clattering into the stable-yard. Contrary to law and decent propriety, Miss Lavinia had been out for a gallop on the common. Her black horse was wet and foaming. The young woman sat her side-saddle superbly. Her dark green London habit almost swept the ground. He knew that she had recognized him as the boy who had stolen the cup the very first time she had met him delivering papers at her house, but she pretended not to. Now she glanced at him, and the chisel mark between the sweeping black brows deepened. "Williams!" she cried. "Dolbear!" There was no groom at the stable to help her dismount. The black horse reared. Johnny smiled. He knew enough about equitation to realize she was showing off. Johnny could make Goblin rear like that any time he pleased. It amused him that she pretended such contempt for him, and yet condescended to show off her skill before him. "Well, you then!" she cried to him. With her nervous horse and long skirts, it was impossible for her to dismount from a side saddle without help. He gave her the help. She did not thank him. It was as if she knew that proximity to such famous beauty was reward enough for any boy or man in Boston. If anyone thanked, obviously it should be Johnny. He thought she was the most disagreeable woman he had ever seen, and yet the fact was he had slipped thus into the light's yard in the hope of seeing her, even risking Captain Bull, and that threatened trip to Guadalupe. He liked to tell Rab how awful she was, and then he would sneak back to take another look. Nearby was William Molino's house. Its seedy appearance advertised to the whole world that its owner was close to bankruptcy. Mr. Molino was standing in his orchard, shaking his cane at a couple of small boys he had treed in an apple tree. He had a terrible temper, which he thoroughly enjoyed. Although Johnny had told him 3 times about those 8 shillings, he was not sure whether the idea had penetrated the wile Irishman's thick skull or not, nor did he care. His good friend Josiah Quincy, plump little John Adams, and James Otis he found together at the Quincy house. They were still sitting over their port and cracking nuts. James Otis did not even look up when Johnny entered. He was hunched up in his chair, his thick-skulled, heavy head hung forward. He was busy drawing a row of little people on the paper before him. Quincy, having already heard about the meeting that night, put a finger to his lips and shook his head, at the same time glancing at the heavy, lonely figure of Otis. Johnny guessed that neither he nor John Adams wanted Otis notified of the meeting, although he was a member. For 4 years, Otis had been crazy and sane, turn and turn about, on again and off again. He was the most brilliant man of them all, thought in the largest terms, not ever merely of Boston, was passionate in his demand for the rights of Englishmen everywhere, over here and in old England too. Now he was not even listening to what was going on about him. His heavy head was swinging back and forth. John Adams and Josiah Quincy were watching him so intently their heads were almost moving a little. Johnny stole out and closed the door softly after him. He guessed that in a day or 2 he'd hear it whispered. James Otis had got into a mad freak and fired guns from the windows of his house. James Otis had been seen leaving Boston in a closed chaise with a doctor and in a straitjacket. Next, he went to Dr. Church. Here was a queer man, surely. He was still in his bedgown and slippers, with paper, inkhorn, and pens about him, writing poetry. Johnny did not care for Molino because he bellowed and roared so loudly, but he disliked Dr. Church. He did not know one thing against him, but he felt the man was crooked, and he knew that Paul Revere and Joseph Warren felt as he felt about Church. Dr. Warren was in Roxbury, tending a sick woman. His wife bade Johnny come back at 5.